They moved my fence 6 feet onto my own land, so I removed the front entrance to their entire neighborhood, and the crazy part is, I didn't raise my voice once because when you have the law and the land on your side, you don't need to shout, be heard. It started on a Tuesday in late October when the air was just starting to get that sharp bite that tells you winter isn't asking permission to come in anymore but just taking what it wants, which I suppose is exactly the same philosophy the developers of the reserves at Whispering Creek had adopted regarding my property line. My family has held title to these 40 acres since my grandfather came back from the Pacific with a little bit of back pay and a whole lot of need for silence, buying this plot when it was nothing but scrub oak and hard clay, and for 3 generations. We respected the boundaries because out here a fence isn't just wire and wood. It is a statement of where your world ends and another man's begins. I had been out of town for 3 days hauling a trailer of heifers to the auction in Abilene, and when I pulled my truck up the gravel drive that my father had paved by hand, I noticed something that made the twist in my stomach tighten like a rusted bolt. The old cedar posts that had marked the western edge of our frontage for 60 years were gone, ripped out of the earth, leaving raw, jagged holes like fresh wounds, and in their place stood a sleek black aluminum barrier that looked expansive and out of place and, most importantly, stood 6 full feet inside my property line. I sat in my truck for a long moment with the engine idling and the vibration humming through the steering wheel into my hands while I watched a landscaping crew in neon yellow vests planting ornamental grasses on a strip of dirt that I paid taxes on. The smell of fresh mulch and diesel hung in the air, a scent that usually means progress but today smelled entirely like theft. I didn't storm out screaming or waving a shotgun because that's what they expect from a man in dirt-stained den. They expect the emotional outburst that they can dismiss as irrational rural anger. But I learned a long time ago that the most dangerous man in the room is the one who is calm enough to take notes. I walked over to the foreman who was shouting instructions over the noise of a skid steer, and when he saw me, he didn't even turn off the machine. He just looked at me with that tired impatience of a man who is used to complaints and doesn't care to hear them. I asked him who authorized the move, and he pointed a gloved thumb toward a temporary trailer parked on the fresh asphalt of the new subdivision's entrance. A grand affair with stone pillars and a waterfall that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of our native drought-resistant landscape. I walked to the trailer, and that's when I met him. The man who would become the architect of his own destruction. A guy named Greg who wore a suit that was too blue and shoes that were too clean for a job site. Greg was the project manager for the Homeowners Association transition team, a corporate climber who looked at my land and saw only an eyesore that hadn't yet been paved over. When I told him his crew had moved my fence onto my property, he didn't even look up from his tablet, just gave a dismissive wave and told me that the new survey adjusted the lines to account for the county's right-of-way expansion, and they were actually doing me a favor by upgrading my fencing for free. He used words like easement and municipal variance, with the confident arrogance of someone who assumes the person they are talking to doesn't know what those words mean. But he made a critical error in judgment because, while I might wear work boots, I also read every single piece of paper that comes through my mailbox. I asked him to show me the survey, and he laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound that wasn't funny at all, and told me that the documents were filed with the county, and if I had a problem I could take it up with the zoning board, which was his polite way of telling me to get lost. He turned his back to me then, dismissing me as a nuisance, a relic of the old world that was in the way of his shiny new future. And as I walked out of that trailer into the bright autumn sun, I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt a cold clarity settling over me. I drove straight to the county clerk's office, a place that smells of dust and old toner and the specific bureaucratic misery of waiting in line. But I wasn't there to wait, I was there to dig. I spent 3 days in the basement archives pulling plat maps dating back to 1954, tracing the history of the property lines through decades of transfers and subdivisions. The clerks knew me by name by the second day, bringing me boxes of my and oversized bound volumes that cracked when you opened them because nobody had looked at them in years. What I found was better than a smoking gun. It was a forgotten handshake. Back in the late 70s, my father had allowed the previous owner of the neighboring lot, a farmer named Miller, to use a corner of our frontage to access his back pasture, because the creek would wash out his lower road every spring. It wasn't an easement, and it wasn't a sale. It was a revocable license for ingress and egress. A verbal agreement memorialized in a notarized letter my dad had insisted on filing just in case Miller ever sold the place. The developers had bought the land from Miller's estate, and their surveyors had seen the existing dirt road and assumed it was a permanent easement, lazily drawing their new lines around it without checking the underlying title restrictions. But the most beautiful part, the detail that made my heart hammer a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs, was the specific wording of the license, which stated that the permission to use the land could be revoked by the grantor or his heirs at any time with 30 days written notice, and crucially, that any improvements made upon said land became the property of the landowner upon revocation. I looked at the map again and overlaid the current satellite imaging. The massive stone entrance monument, the waterfall, the electric gate system, and the perfectly manicured flower beds of the reserves were all sitting squarely on that patch. of land my father had let Miller drive his tractor over. They hadn't just moved my fence. They had built their entire front door in my living room. I paid for certified copies of every single page, the stamp of the county clerk hitting the paper with a heavy thud that sounded like a gavel falling. And then I went to see a lawyer I knew, a man named Patterson who operated out of a strip mall and wore suits that had seen better days, but who knew property law better than he knew his own children. Patterson looked at the documents, looked at me, and then a slow grin spread across his face. The kind of grin a wolf makes when the wind changes and brings the scent of a wounded deer. We drafted the letter together, not a lawsuit, just a simple notice of revocation of license, citing the specific deed book and page number, informing the HOA and the development company that their permission to use the strip of land was hereby revoked and that they had 30 days to vacate the premises. We sent it certified mail, return receipt requested, to Greg, to the HOA board, and to the corporate headquarters of the development firm. Then, I waited. The silence from their end was deafening for the first 2 weeks, presumably because they were scrambling to find a lawyer who could tell them they were right, only to be told that they were catastrophically wrong. On day 19, Greg's car came tearing up my driveway, kicking up gravel and dust, and this time he wasn't looking at his tablet. He pounded on my front door, and when I opened it he was red-faced and sweating, waving the letter in my face. Certainly about extortion and good faith and how I couldn't possibly do this. I stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, and let him run out of breath. When he finally stopped gasping, I told him calmly that he had 11 days left to move his entrance off my land. He laughed again, but this time it was a desperate, nervous sound, and he told me that moving the entrance would cost 6 figures, that they would have to regrade the entire drainage system, that I was being unreasonable over a few feet of dirt. I reminded him that he was the one who said the survey lines were absolute and that he was just upgrading my fencing. So I was simply reclaiming what was mine. He threatened to sue, threatened to bury me in legal fees, threatened to call the sheriff, and I just nodded and told him that was his right, just as it was my right to clear the obstructions from my property once the 30 days were up. He stormed off, spinning his tires as he left, and I went back inside to finish my coffee, which tasted particularly good that morning. The next 10 days were a flurry of legal threats from their corporate attorneys, letters arriving daily filled with aggressive language and demands for mediation, all of which Patterson replied to with a single sentence, referencing the irrevocable nature of the property boundaries and the expiration of the license. They tried to get an emergency injunction, but the judge, a man who also owned land in the county and hated HOA overreach, denied it on the grounds that the documentation was clear and they had been given ample notice. The 30th they arrived, on a Friday. I had rented a large excavator, a 20-ton machine with a thumb attachment on the bucket, and I parked it near the property line the night before, just so they would know I was serious. At 8 a.m., the deadline expired. I walked out to the machine, did my pre-flight check, checking the oil and the hydraulic fluid, taking my time while a small crowd of neighbors from the subdivision gathered on the other side of the property line, whispering and pointing. Greg was there too, on the phone, pacing back and forth, looking like he was trying to negotiate a hostage release. I climbed into the cab, the smell of grease and old upholstery welcoming me, and fired up the engine, the diesel roar drowning out Greg's shouting. I didn't start with the fence. I started with the landscaping. I dropped the bucket and scraped the ornamental grasses and the imported mulch into a pile, clearing the strip of land down to the red clay that my grandfather had walked on. Then I turned the machine toward the entrance monument. It was a massive structure, stone veneer over cinder block, with the reserves etched in gold lettering that probably cost more than my truck. Greg came running toward the machine, waving his arms, and I paused, throttling down just enough to hear him scream that he had called the police. I pointed to the clock on the dashboard and then to the property line, shrugging my shoulders. A deputy did pull up a few minutes later, a young guy I knew from the feed store, and Greg rushed him, pointing at me and screaming about destruction of property. The deputy walked over to the cab. I shut off the engine, and I handed him the stack of documents I had prepared, the deed, the revocation notice, the proof of service, and the judge's denial of their injunction. The deputy read through them, adjusted his hat, walked back over to Greg, and I watched the color drain from Greg's face as the deputy explained that this was a civil matter and that technically the structure was on my land and considered abandoned property after the notice period. The deputy got back in his cruiser and drove away, and the silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I started the engine back up. I swung the boom around and brought the bucket down on top of the stone pillar with a force that shook the ground, the stone crumbling like a stale cracker, the gold letters twisting and snapping as the structure collapsed into a heap of rubble. The waterfall feature was next, the piping tearing loose with the sprays of water that quickly turned to mud as I ripped the basin out of the ground. I wasn't being reckless. I was being surgical. I dismantled the entire entrance, piece by piece, stacking the debris in a neat pile on the edge of the road, reclaiming the 6 feet of land they had stolen and the extra 20 feet they had borrowed. It took me 4 hours to clear the encroachment, And by the time I was done, the grand entrance, to the reserves was nothing but a flat patch of dirt and a pile of broken rock. Greg had disappeared hours ago, presumably to update his resume, but the neighbors were still watching, and to my surprise, a few of them gave me a thumbs up, probably realizing that the HOA fees they were paying were going to arrogant mismanagement. I shut down the excavator and sat there for a moment in the quiet, looking at the land that was finally, indisputably mine again. The victory wasn't in the destruction, it was in the restoration of the boundary, the re-establishment of the line. That said, this far and no further. The following Monday, the development company's regional vice president contacted Patterson not to threaten, but to negotiate. They had no entrance. Their residents were driving over a temporary gravel patch I had graciously left intact for emergency access, and they needed a solution fast. We settled on a new easement agreement, one that was written correctly this time. They paid me a lump sum that was 3 times the market value of the land, covered all my legal fees, and agreed to build a new fence, a proper one, with stone columns that matched my house and steel rails, placed exactly on the surveyed line. They also agreed to a permanent reduction in the visual height of their new entrance monument, so it wouldn't block my view of the valley. It took them 3 months to rebuild what I tore down in an afternoon, and every time I drive past their new, humbler entrance, I get a wave from the security guard who knows exactly who signs the checks on the easement lease. It's funny how people talk about being neighborly when they want something from you. But true neighborliness is based on respect, and respect is based on boundaries. They thought they could push a line on a map and that I would just roll over because they had money and lawyers and a polished brochure image, but they forgot that land isn't just an asset to the people who live on it. It's a history, a legacy, and a responsibility. I didn't enjoy destroying their entrance, at least not the destruction itself, but I enjoyed the undeniable proof that right is still right, and that no amount of corporate bullying can change a deed recorded in 1954. I replanted the grass on my side of the new fence, blending it back into the pasture. And now you can't even tell that for a few months a piece of suburbia tried to swallow a piece of history. The fence stands where it should, the cows graze where they should, and the world is in order. Sometimes you have to tear something down to set things straight, and sometimes you have to be the bad guy in someone else's story to be the hero in your own. So when people ask me if I went too far, if I should have just taken a payout initially, or tried to talk it out more, I tell them that I did talk. They just didn't listen until the stones started falling. It makes you wonder about the lines we draw in our own lives, about what we let people take from us inch by inch until we suddenly realize we've lost ground that we can never get back. Was I justified in how I handled it? Or was I just a bitter old man with a heavy machine and a grudge? I know where I stand, right here on my own dirt. But I'm curious what you would have done if you looked out your window and saw someone else's wall on your land. Drop your thoughts in the comments below because I read more than you think, and I reckon a lot of you have dealt with a Greg or two in your time.